Hi, today I will be walking through a short tutorial explaining some basic grid functionality in the NextGen Designer. For this tutorial, I have created a simple demo form that is designed for a user to enter the results of restaurant inspections into a grid. As you can see, I have added single-line edit fields for the restaurant name and the sanitation rating received by the restaurant. There is also a date field for the inspection date. This information will be used to populate the columns of our grid. I also have added an action button, which I will explain more about later. Now, to add our grid, let's go back to the palette, select the grid, and drag it onto our form. I'm going to name the grid Inspected Restaurants, and this field ID will be how we refer to the grid in our scripting. Also, note the options on the right side of the screen. These refer to what can be done within the grid. For this example, we only want the ability to delete rows from within the grid. Adding rows will be handled by scripting. We'll talk about editing rows in another video. Now we have our grid in place. Let's move to the Preview tab and take a look. As we can see, this is not a very helpful grid. We're going to want to rename these columns, and also we have no data. We're going to need a way to enter some data. So let's move over to the Script tab and see how we can accomplish that. The first thing we want to do is add our column headers. We can accomplish that by calling the _form.gridColumnData method from within our AfterOpen method. The first argument to this method is the name of the grid we are referring to, in this case our Inspected Restaurants grid. The second argument is an array of strings where each string refers to a column in the grid. In this example, our first column will be called Restaurant Name, our second column will be called Inspection Date, and our third column will be called Sanitation Rating. Now, if we go back to our Preview tab and open the grid, we see that our column names now appear. So our next step is to make sure we can add to our grid. For this form, we fill in the information for restaurant name, inspection date, and sanitation rating, and then click Add Inspection. I'll add an example inspection now. Notice our entry now appears in the grid. So now let's move back over to the Script tab and see what we did to make that happen. The first thing we need is a way to trigger the addition of a row using the hotspot button. So I've used the hotspot pressed event handler, and when the add inspection hotspot is pressed, I've called the add inspection function that I created below. Now, to add an inspection to our grid, we are going to need to add a row and then modify the contents of each column in that row with the appropriate data. To add a row, use the _form.addGridRow method. Pass the name of the grid you wish to add to as an argument to that method. This method returns the row number of the newly added row, and we're going to refer to that using the variable row ID. Next, we want to put the appropriate data into the columns of the row we just added. We do this using the _form.editGridCellValue method. This method takes 4 arguments. The first is the name of the grid we are referring to. The second is the ID of the row we want to edit, which we refer to with the variable row ID. The third is the ID of the column we want to edit. Column IDs are numbered starting at 0 and go in the order in which they were added. In our case, since restaurant name is our first column, it will have an ID of 0. Since inspection date is our second column, it will have an ID of 1, and so on. To keep track of these, I find it helpful to create constants that refer to these column indexes at the top. That way, I only have to worry about which columns have which ID when I create them. After that, I can refer to them just using these constants. Returning now to adding to our row. The final argument given to the editGridCellValue method is the actual value we want the cell to have. In this case, on line 22, we are trying to modify the restaurant name column, so the value we will give it is whatever value was entered into the restaurant name field. Similarly, on line 23, since we are trying to modify the inspection date column, the value we pass will be whatever was entered into the inspection date field. The same goes for the sanitation rating column. Now, since our new row has been added and all of its values are now appropriately set, we want to end by clearing the entry fields so they are now open for more restaurant inspections to be added. Let's return to the Preview tab and show some examples. Once we have a few entries in our grid, we can expand it and choose an option. We can also go into the grid and delete rows straight from within the app by selecting the Delete Selected button. You should now be familiar with how to set up a grid's columns, add rows to the grid, and delete rows. Check out our other help videos to learn about more advanced grid features like editing rows and accessing information from selected rows.